Right, so for objective number 5, this is the last part of the advertising management module. We're going to look at different ways of allocating advertising budgets, and I'm going to take a slightly different tack on this final lecture module. I'm going to use some of the multi-choice questions that we may or may not use in the second terms test. So pay particular attention not only to how I explain the concepts, but also how you may make a decision as to which is the most correct answer if you were to encounter some of these multi-choice questions later on. So for the first part of this lecture on advertising budgets, we're going to look at some of the different types of budget allocation methods that are available or commonly used in industry. And then based on the question, I'll explain the thought process as to why one answer is the most appropriate compared to the other options. So the first question there is, most small firms use the something method to determine their advertising budget. So you've got 5 options below: competitive parity method, marginal cost, objective and task method, percentage of sales, or the ever popular option of none of the answers are correct. Okay, so before I give you the answer, let's think about some of these options here that are available. The competitive parity method is a method where a business looks at the other competitors within its industry or its sector and then allocates the budget depending on what other people are doing. Hence, it's called the competitive parity method. So you want to be on par with what the others are doing. And so this is a form of budget allocation that is popular because it is not particularly difficult once you figure out what other people are spending. And it's also, more importantly, very easily defensible to the manager or the CEO or to the client. Because if you think about, someone saying, well, why have you spent this amount of money? And you say, well, that's because that's what the competitors are spending. Then you've automatically got a sort of a safety net in terms of a defensible argument. So that's the competitive parity method. Obviously, there's a problem with that logic because if, just for example, you're Pepsi and you know that Coke spends a certain amount per annum on advertising and you spend that same amount, then that doesn't really take into consideration your position in the market, right? Maybe you need to spend more in order to capture their market, or maybe you don't need to spend as much as they do because of other factors, right? So the competitive parity method, while easy and easily defensible, is not particularly logical. The second choice is marginal cost. So for those of you that have access to the textbook, you'll know that that is just a false herring. That's not an actual option. So we'll move on to the third option, which is objective and task. So the objective and task method is probably the best method of budget allocation because that's based on setting objectives and figuring out the tasks that are required for you to achieve those objectives and then allocating the budget in that way. So there's a bit of this explained in the textbook, but basically the previous module looked at advertising objectives and we talked about how important they were in terms of holding advertising accountable. So the objective and task method of budget allocation then really breaks down the objectives, such as increasing brand awareness from 20 to 40%, and then figuring out the tasks that you actually need to implement to raise the level of brand awareness from 20 to 40%, and then tries to figure out how much it will cost to do that based on the media you will spend, based on the creative input that you might need to invest, and a whole number of other tools that will need to be implemented in order to achieve those objectives, and then you spend the budget according to that. So you can see how that's a far more complicated way of allocating budget, but it's also probably the most functional way. Option number 3 is the percentage of sales. So I'll wait for a different slide to explain that. But if you look at these options here, then the most correct answer is the competitive parity method. And that's because most small firms, they don't have the time or the resources to really invest into figuring out, exactly how they're going to spend their advertising budget because they're so busy doing other aspects of their day-to-day business that using the competitive parity method is the simplest and the quickest way of deciding how much you should spend on your advertising budget. So the second question, continuing on with different ways of allocating advertising budget, is this question here. In the something method, only the funds that remain after budgeting for everything else are spent on advertising. Okay, so we know that that can't be the competitive parity method, because I've just explained that that method is based on looking at what others are spending, other competitors, and then trying to be on par with them. So we know option A is not correct. Affordability method, this means that whatever you can afford, you should spend on advertising. We've already explained what the objective and task method is, and we know that it can't possibly fit into that answer. Arbitrary allocation method, once again, that's a false herring, it's not an actual thing. And then the percentage of sales method. So the percentage of sales method is where you look at how much sales, either historically that you've made the previous year, and then you allocate a percentage of that to devote to advertising, or in most cases, companies try to predict or anticipate the percentage of sales in terms of budget allocation. So that means they anticipate how many sales they may make this year, and then they allocate a certain percentage to that. So that's not really quite the best answer for this question. So the best answer is, in fact, the affordability method. So that's actually a thing. You wouldn't believe it, that people actually make decisions on how much they should spend on advertising based on whatever they can afford. But that is a thing that some companies do. It's not advisable because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever just to chuck what's left over, but a lot of businesses, particularly the small to medium enterprises, do that because they're so busy spending on other stuff that they see as more important that they don't really devote the time and attention they need to really figure out what they should be spending on advertising, and so they just kind of throw whatever is left over that they can afford to spend on advertising, hence the affordability method. Another question here. So the percentage of sales budgeting method has been criticized because the method does something. So what's wrong with this type of a budget allocation method, percentage of sales? So one option is that the percentage of sales budgeting method has been criticized because the method reverses the logical relationship between sales and advertising. Or is it because it ignores brand image development? Or is it because it's based on historical data? Finally, there's the option that all of those are correct, and also that none of those are correct. The thing with multi-choice, so this is a technical, I guess, skill side note, is that when you're answering multi-choice questions, you don't want to overthink it too much sometimes. If you really think about options D and E here, they don't make any sense, because if all of the questions are correct, then E can't possibly be correct. Likewise, if you think E is the correct answer, then that can't be right, because D, all of the answers supplied for this question are correct, including E, right? So I've had some students kind of go a little bit crazy overthinking these questions. So don't overthink the multi-choice questions. My advice is to get familiar with the material and then go with your gut instinct. So if we go back to the top three options, because one of those is the most correct answer, the right answer is option A. The percentage of sales budgeting method is criticized because it reverses the logical relationship between sales and advertising. So the way the percentage of sales budgeting method works is that, as I mentioned before, you either look at historical data, which is how many sales you made last year, and then you base a certain percentage on that, or you try and anticipate the sales you will make in the current year and allocate a percentage of that. The problem with that is because if sales are down either last year or you're anticipating that sales will be down this year, that means that inherently you will allocate a smaller percentage to advertising, when in fact that's actually an incorrect way of thinking, because if your sales are going to be down, maybe you need to advertise more to increase demand, right, and therefore increase your sales and your revenue. The other problem is that it's assuming that the amount of money that you've that comes from sales to devote to advertising is how much you should be spending on advertising, when really the relationship is the other way around. The amount of money you've spent on advertising has led to the sales that you are now getting, right? So it's a bit back to front there, and that's why that's the most correct answer in this particular question. So now I'm going to look at two theoretical arguments that when you decide to, allocate budget to advertising. On the one hand, you have some people that follow this concave downward response curve. So this is the law of diminishing returns, and you'll see on the graph there that on the y-axis you have incremental sales, whereas on the x-axis you'll have the amount of money you spend on advertising. The people that believe in this argument suggest that you get your biggest bang for buck in the first couple of dollars spent on advertising, right? So you spend a little bit and you'll see the results immediately, because the theory behind that is that people are either going to buy a product or not, and continuing to advertise to people that are not already buying your product or not interested won't change their minds. So this is a weak model of advertising. It's suggesting that advertising does not actually change behavior that much, and that all it does is that it raises awareness, and if people happen to be in that mindset and they want to buy a product anyway that's similar to the one that you're offering, seeing the advertisement will push them in the right direction, give them a little nudge, and they'll respond. Everyone else after that, it doesn't matter how many times you communicate, how much you spend on advertising, you're not going to convince them. Hence, this law of diminishing returns sees the best return on investment dollars at the beginning of the ad expenditure, and any subsequent expenditure does not really add anything further to your return. So that's one way of looking at advertising. And of course, if you believe that, you'll be spending your ad budget quite differently. The converse argument is the S-shaped response curve, and this is the law of momentum, and this works slightly differently. So if you look at the graph there, once again on the y-axis we have incremental sales, but on the x-axis you have the same thing, ad expenditure, but different things happen there. So there's this particular argument breaks up ad spending into three specific zones. In zone A, you're spending money, the first couple of dollars that you spend don't actually do much, because in order for the advertising to have an effect, you must overcome this hump in the middle, this B zone, right? And only at that point will you start to see the return of your advertising spend. Then it goes up, and then it plateaus off in zone C. And at that point, what happens is more similar to the law of diminishing returns, because you can't spend infinitely on advertising and expect an exponential growth curve, right? So the key difference here between the two graphs is that the one that's on the right-hand side of the slide, the law of momentum suggests that you're not going to see much in the first couple of dollars you spend on advertising. And in fact, you have to keep at it in order to make people change their preferences or their behavior in some way. And then once that happens and you overcome this resistance in zone B, that's when you see the advertising expenditure, the investment bring a return. And if you believe in that line of argument, then you're suggesting that advertising does have a stronger effect, because you're initially spending on stuff and it's not enough. You're not advertising enough to get the effect, the change in behavior that you want. But if you keep at it, you will overcome some resistance in some way, and the advertising has a stronger effect on changing people's behavior. In either case, return on investment is important, because whether you're spending early on, or you're spending consistently, or you're using the competitive parity method, or you're using the objective and task method, it doesn't really matter. In all cases, you want a return on investment. And different departments will look at advertising in different ways. In the very first lecture, I said that sometimes it's seen as an expense. And so your stereotypical accountant will try to minimize the expenses, so they will say don't spend as much on advertising, and then therefore that will automatically increase your profit. On the other hand, marketers, that's us, our job is to, position marketing spend and advertising spend as an essential investment, right? And for that argument, we're saying that advertising will increase volume, and it will increase the price that you charge per unit by building brand image or building some sort of preference or repeat purchase. And then the question, though, is what will management see? And I guess our job as marketing and advertisers is to convince them of the importance of investing in marketing spend and in advertising spend in order to take a revenue generation approach. But the most basic rule in all cases is that the amount of revenue generated by the advertising should obviously exceed its cost. The formula for calculating ROI is gross profit minus the marketing investment that you've just put into advertising, divided by that marketing investment, times by 100 to give you a percentage. So we'll work through a couple of examples here. We'll argue that you're making the same amount of money, just to keep things simple. So let's say $2,000 is what you're bringing in, and in this particular case, you've spent $1,000 on advertising. So 2,000 minus 1,000 is 1,000 divided by 1,000 times 100 gives you 100%. So that means for every dollar you're spending, you're getting $1 back. This is a supremely good return on investment, right? There's no bank out there that will give you $1 for every dollar you're investing. And so this is like the golden ideal scenario. But if you were to come up with an ROI that good, I would really put my critical lenses on and think, how are you able to justify such a great return on investment? And we would really get into sort of the nitty-gritty of what you're trying to argue. Let's take a look at a slightly more realistic scenario, which is still a very good return on investment, right? So the example in the second scenario is, once again, you're bringing in $2,000, but you've spent a little bit more this time, right? 1,500. So 2,000 minus 1,500 divided by 1,500 gives you 0.33 reoccurring. Multiply that by 100 to get 33% return on investment. No bank out there is giving you 33% return on investment. So this is also a very good number. Once again, if we got that number, 33%, we'll be looking at exactly how you're doing this. A couple of things when you're working on your own projects that are easier to do versus those that are harder. Okay, so you know how much money you would make depending on the units sold, because that information is provided, right? You know the cost of goods sold and you know the profit margin that Zuru gets. So working out the profit is easy in that extent. You also know how much money you're spending, right? Because we expect you to look up how much it costs, for example, to place a magazine ad or to bid for a word on Google AdWords or to hire a billboard, right? So those costs are pretty concrete, and so therefore you know how much it costs. So the real trick then is to figure out how much profit you're actually going to bring in the first place, i.e. how many units are you going to be able to sell depending on how much money you've invested in the advertising. So you can tell us how much you've spent, but you can't really predict with 100% certainty how many units that's going to end up selling. So that's the tricky part, and that requires a lot of, I guess, justification and a lot of thinking. So if you spend $20,000 on a billboard, you know you've spent $20,000 on the billboard. You also know to a certain extent how many people you can reach with that billboard, because a lot of these advertising suppliers will give you stats and data on certain, whatever media they're selling, magazines or billboards or, television shows, what the ratings are, what the traffic is, what the subscription readership numbers are. So you know how many people you're reaching. The problem then is how many of those people are in your target market and how many of those people will you convert into buying the product that's being sold. So this is the conversion rate we're talking about. And until you figure out what your conversion rate is, it's impossible to figure out what your gross profit will be. So that's the key, figuring out conversion rate. And to be honest, there's no rule of figuring out what that is. So even some social media advertising tools will give you estimated conversion rates, but this is just them trying to make their medium look better than competing medium, right? So it really does depend on the creative output. So that's what we'll be looking at in the next module, because the more creative something is, the more compelling it might be, and the higher the conversion rate. Alternatively, it could be about what other tools you've implemented to really get that behavioral feedback, that behavioral change. So if you're able to, implement some sort of sales promotion or a really cool prize or a competition, you could then argue that might encourage people to buy your product more, given the other campaigns that are out there that don't have that same behavioral hook. Right, so figuring out the conversion rate is the key to coming with a accurate return on investment calculation. So the final example here, this is a bad example, hence the red, is that you're still making $2,000, but you've had to spend $3,000 to do that. So you already know from that basic math that it's not going to turn out very good, right? So 2,000 minus 3,000 divided by 3,000 gives you negative 0.33 recurring. So that's a negative 33% return on your investment. In other words, you've lost money. You haven't even broken even. And that's an outcome that we definitely don't want to see from any of the groups. So in this slide, we'll look at share of voice and share of market. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the competitor share of voice. So this is how much, I guess, attention the competitors have of the target market that you're competing for. Down the bottom, it's your share of market. Now, share of voice and share of market are usually correlated. The bigger the share of market, usually the bigger the share of voice, and vice versa. The more voice you have within a market, that usually translates to a higher share of market. So that's usually the correlation that goes together. Not in every case. Sometimes you have, businesses that have a massive share of voice, but they still have a small share of market. And in other cases, you may have a small company with a small share of market, but maybe they are advertising a lot for a particular time period, and so they have a high share of voice. But in most cases, the two things are correlated. So if we look at that grid, we'll see there's different, I guess, strategies for how to spend your advertising dollar, depending on what position you are in and depending on what position your nearest competitor is in. So in quadrant A, if your competitors have a really high share of voice, so they're doing a lot of advertising, but you have a low share of market, then that means you're being outgunned. They have a bigger advertising budget and they're outspending you. You can't compete with that because you have a low share of market. So that usually means that your revenue is going to be smaller, and it probably means you're a smaller company to begin with. So this means you need to find a niche and decrease your ad spending and really target in on those people that you can capture from your competitors, because your competitors are more mainstream in this case, and they're blanketing the market with their advertising, hence their higher share of voice, but you need to find the people that are more relevant to your offering. Quadrant B, so this is when you're both relatively dominant companies. You have a high share of market and your competitors have a high share of voice. Unfortunately, the only thing you can do there is to continue the arms race of advertising, which is something we call a term that we refer to in terms of the biggest companies usually having to outspend each other in their advertising. And you see this all the time. Just look at McDonald's and Burger King, for example, or Coke and Pepsi. Any large brands where they are fighting for the larger share of market, no one can afford to decrease in ad spending, because the moment they put the foot on the brake, so to speak, the other competitors' volume of advertising will quickly overwhelm the market, and they will start to gain market share. And so you have, sort of this one-upping of advertising spend, which ironically results in lower profits for both companies. Quadrant C, this is when both of you, your competitors and yourself, are relatively small. Maybe you're both in a new market, so you're both beginning, or you just happen to be niche products in your own rights. So what you want to do then is increase your ad spending, because you're both growing, so you want to get in fast, spend more on advertising so that more people get to know about your brand, and then you're capturing that market while the competitors are still in their infancy. So you get first mover advantage there. And the final quadrant is D, maintain your ad spending to preempt competitors' activities. So this occurs when you're the dominant market force, you've got high share of market, and you've got these, I guess, smaller companies that are biting at your heels, right? And so they could capture some of your market if you don't maintain your ad spending, because you have to flip it around in your head, and if you were them, then your marketing manager might be advising you to spend more money to try and capture some of the market share of the dominant business, which in this case, in quadrant D, you're the dominant business, right? So you want to be aware of what the other smaller businesses are doing, and you want to maintain your ad spending in order to just keep them at bay. You don't need to increase it too much because they're not a threat yet, but you do need to maintain that level of ad spending. So just to just to summarize now the entire set of modules that we had for advertising management, you'll recall we have 5 objectives, and this is what I guess the take-home message for each objective was. So in objective number 1, we asked the question of whether advertising was worth it or not, and we looked at a formula that compared revenue and expenses and the role of advertising in that formula. And I guess the take-home message there from a marketing perspective is that advertising should be seen as an investment. In objective 2, we looked at price elasticity. So we looked at how some products might be more price elastic, whereas others might be more advertising elastic. But in reality, it's a combination of both. And then it's up to you as the marketer and the advertiser to try and make your product or service more advertising elastic rather than just price elastic, because the only option for a price elastic product is sales discounting. Whereas with an advertising elastic product, it gives you a little bit more wiggle room in terms of how you might want to build your brand image or how you might want to reach out to your target market. In objective 3, we looked at the 5 main functions of advertising. So that was summarized by the acronym IPRA. So that was to inform, persuade, remind, add value, and assist. In objective 4, we looked at the importance of setting objectives and how they are crucial in any advertising campaign in order to make advertising more accountable, which is what clients are looking for. And we also looked at the communications effects pyramid and how, for the same amount of money you spend to get people to be aware of your brand, that same amount would only get a very small percentage to regularly buy your brand, because as you move up that communications pyramid and get to that behavior, it's a lot harder to do. And finally, today we looked at the objective number 5, which was the different ways of allocating budget. And it doesn't really matter which way is used. The key is to be able to figure out a return on investment for your advertising spend. And the key to that is to try to figure out or justify the conversion rate that you hope to be able to obtain if you roll out your proposed advertising campaign.